Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, as we've had a little bit more time to take a look at the what I'm going to officially call a game changer in the Oreshnik missile system, there's more and more that's coming out about it. One of the terms that is being used is it's the equivalent of a tactical nuke without the fear of radiation. And with this being said, it can hit any targets within less than an hour, nearly around the world. And it's something that the West has absolutely no answer to. And this at a time when the Russian military is moving rapidly through Ukraine. Zelensky obviously is desperate to try to hold on to what remains and still have ties to NATO. So I think it's important that we talk about what this new weapon system means to not just the SMO that's going on in Ukraine, but perhaps to the wider scope of geopolitics. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion. And what are your thoughts overall of what's going on in Ukraine today?
Well, firstly, thank you as well for joining me today, Ken. It's always a pleasure. Been a bit of a gap since we last did things, but anyway, let's crack on. Well, I think some more details have come out about this Oreshnik intermediate range ballistic missile. We know it travels at Mach 10, but also some additional details comes out. And this, for me, was very fascinating because I'm pretty sure you and I have discussed this, and I've made reference to the fact that in the Syrian war, particularly when the Russians started to get involved, and for a number of years they were showcasing military technology, new technology. And one of those involved weapons technology that literally reduced a tank to dust. Now, why am I mentioning this? And I'm not suggesting that Russia was already utilizing the Oreshnik missile at that point in time, but the technology may be sort of obviously interoperable with other missile systems because now we definitively know that the warhead reaches a temperature of 4,000 degrees Celsius, which indeed makes it highly destructive, and that anything in its blast zone would effectively be broken down into what you might term elementary particles, meaning it is reduced quite literally to dust. The other thing the Oreshnik can do, it can target well protected structures that are deeply buried below ground. So it's very effective against fortified sites. And whilst, and you're right, it's not classified as a weapon of mass destruction, basically, it's certainly capable of causing enormous destruction, but critically, without the use of a nuclear warhead. And it's definitely also capable of conducting extremely precise strikes. It has, therefore, it can attack high value targets with pinpoint accuracy. Now, in that sense, this is a game changer. In principle, the technology itself, yes, certainly reducing things to dust is not something the West, well, they certainly won't admit to, but they saw evidence of this in Syria and were panic stricken as to what this meant. So this is taking it on to a stage further, and certainly in terms of being a intermediate range ballistic missile, it has the potential as well to have nuclear warheads attached to it. We're not remotely suggesting Russia has any intention of doing so, but it's just the fact that this is in principle a possibility, and also more importantly, the West is now fully aware of what the potential of this Oreshnik is, and therefore they're now having to start to rethink their strategy with regards to Ukraine. And we've noticed, and I don't want to tempt fate, but we haven't seen any further evidence of these ATACMS or Storm Shadow missiles being used by Ukraine. Having said that, now I've probably said it, it'll probably happen tomorrow as a result of it. But, you know, jokes aside with regards to that, and I'm not joking about the missiles themselves, of course, just the fact it hasn't happened. And you know what it's like, you say something and then it's kind of the proverbial kiss of death. But what I think is very telling as well is that Rutte's come out, who's the new NATO Secretary General, saying that all the senior diplomats in the NATO alliance will discuss, note Russia's attack on this military industrial complex facility with this Oreshnik missile. I mean, he stated this at a press conference ahead of NATO foreign ministers meeting, and he said, of course, and they try to play it down like, well, it's not a game changer and it's not going to change the course of the conflict nor deter NATO allies from supporting Ukraine. Now, of course, it absolutely is, because given the nature of what this missile is capable of achieving, even if it is a non-nuclear missile, the West has to take it seriously. To make this statement is just rhetoric for the masses in the West, while privately, of course, they're extremely concerned as to what this missile capability is. And of course, this came hot on the heels where Zelensky came out and again makes these ridiculous demands, asking NATO to supply Kiev with the latest weapons to test them on Ukrainian territory under the conditions of a real military conflict. I mean, as though the West is going to give Zelensky anything that's experimental. Absolutely not. The big mistake that he's making and other people in the West are is when Russia said, we're testing this missile, they meant they were testing it in a real live conflict situation. They will have tested this multiple times prior to this and made sure it does achieve its objectives. It's not like it was the first time they ever tried to implement this and strike a target so specifically. Now, it's worth recalling, of course, that probably 2 weeks ago or so, the United States and NATO had announced, of course, they were going to authorize Ukraine's use of these longer range weapons to hit inside Russia. And that resulted in them trying to strike facilities in Kursk and Bryansk regions, which are both in Russia. And of course, Russia responded with this Oreshnik hypersonic intermediate range ballistic missile, which, bearing in mind, of course, because it's hypersonic, there's no missile defense system in the West capable of being able to shoot this missile out the sky. And that, of course, was this destruction of this Ukrainian defense facility, which is that Yuzhmash plant in Dnipro. Now, obviously, the West's trying to make out nothing happened, but they haven't shown any images to demonstrate nothing happened. The belief is that plant was literally reduced to dust. Of course, we don't have any evidence to support that either, but certainly huge amounts of damage was done. And Russia's made this point, if you continue with these provocative policies, you could have dire consequences. So again, it comes back to the point, this is a game changer. It's changed attitudes and mindsets in the West. They didn't initially, because we subsequently had more strikes, although they were largely dealt with by Russia's missile defense system. So as an initial talking point, I think this is hugely significant and relevant to the broader context of what's unfolding in Ukraine itself.
Yeah, I think it's important that people realize that when they measure the power of a nuclear, whether it's a large nuclear or a minor one or tactical versus strategic, that it's measured in certain amounts of TNT power, dynamite, for all intents and purposes. And really, all it is a kinetic weapon. So you take the kinetic capabilities and the mass of the weapon, and then just create the equation that you need. And that's where this is coming out, where the potential of a low-grade tactical nuke without the aftermath of radiation, and you can have the equivalent of, I'll give a great example. The official, we're not going to get into these weeds, but the official report was that a aircraft went into the Twin Towers and subsequently vaporized the steel, and the building came down. Well, jet fuel burns at 1675 Celsius. This now is at 4,000. And if allegedly jet fuel can vaporize steel in a building, imagine what something two and a half times its heat signature can do. And then, of course, you take a look at what's occurring as well. Let's see, what is it? Pro, they've just about passed, or at least they've stumbled upon the last line of defense for Ukraine. I always mispronounce it, Poroshkov, something like that. And I've always attributed it to like World War I, the Hindenburg Line. Once they passed the Hindenburg Line of defense, that was on September 29th of 1918. The armistice came just a little more than a month later. I think we're really at the point, and this is what you see coming out with NATO not really making all of these bombastic statements like they did just a couple months ago. Zelensky now saying, "Hey, as long as we can get into NATO, we'll sign anything on the table." These things are, the really the end of the conflict is coming to bear, and it makes you wonder too, because there's so many other conflicts that we're going to talk about in other podcasts taking place in the world. Does the US, does NATO, does anybody else really want to spend any more time and effort in Ukraine when much of the rest of the world is starting to blow up?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and it's interesting just before we go on about the sort of reaction in the West and what Zelensky's been saying, I wanted to make reference to the fact that in recent days, the last sort of week and a half, Russia's been using its Iskander tactical missile systems that have destroyed between 5 and 10 Western-made launchers used for firing, what a surprise, ATACMS long-range missiles. So they hit rocket launchers. These were in the Sumy region. Anyone who doesn't know where Sumy region is, obviously that borders Russia in northeastern Ukraine. It's obviously a region above where Kharkov is. And these are clearly being used for firing these ATACMS. Now, you would obviously surmise that Russia realized when those attack and missile strikes were happening, they were being launched from Sumy, and they've taken care of it. So obviously MLRS launchers and transport, a load of vehicles were destroyed near the city of Sumy, and HIMARS launchers were destroyed about 20 kilometers southeast of Sumy. So not only has Russia made their statement with the Oreshnik missile, but they've also made it abundantly clear, look, we know where those missiles came from, and now we're going to take out the Western-made launchers used to fire these missiles. So that is like a double whammy in terms of the West's capability to not only have any ATACMS, because Ukraine doesn't have that many, and they've used quite a lot up already with little or no damage. But this is another example where Russia is able to pinpoint and attack missile defense systems, or in this case, Western-made launchers. So I just wanted to throw that in as a small point. Now, when it comes to Zelensky's made some very interesting statements, because he's gone from being, as you say, very bombastic to going, well, diplomacy is the only option, and then weirdly said, but it'll only be possible when Ukraine is strong enough. Hang on, the reason you resort to diplomacy is because you're so weak that you can't defeat Russia. And in the next breath, he goes, well, the Ukrainian army is now powerless to push back Russian forces and to recapture the territories that belonged to Kiev before 2014, adding that his country must rely on diplomacy to achieve this goal. So they think that Russia's just going to give it up because you have some diplomatic, initiative with the Ukrainians. Of course, this is nonsense. And this came in an interview he did with Kyoto News, and he said that Ukraine wants to end the conflict as soon as possible, but we want to retake Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. When he said after the prospects of joining NATO become clear, I mean, he knows full well that Ukraine is never going to join NATO. And not least because yes, his army does lack the capability to do that. So they're going to have to find diplomatic solutions. But apparently, I don't know how you can have a diplomatic solution when they're strong enough and Russia's prevented from launching new offensives, because if they're prevented from launching new offensives, it means that militarily you're the match for them. If you're not the match for them, then what you're basically saying is, well, the war's over. We can't win the war. We're only going to continue to lose more and more territory. And then, of course, there's mention of this ridiculous victory plan, and this puts us in a strong position for negotiation. Now, frankly, I don't see the point anymore of Zelensky making these ridiculous statements that have no basis in reality. Because, this plan, which came out in October, really, just was laughed out of the court, basically, by NATO privately. We want an invitation to join NATO. We want unrestricted military support. And we want to place conventional deterrence measures in Ukraine to keep Russia at bay. I mean, and it is just nonsense. And of course, the Trump team's gone, well, we're studying this plan, but there's not going to be any capitulation from the side of Ukraine. And, so there's this huge climb down and making statements that make no sense whatsoever. Like, well, we're going to have to now recruit 18-year-olds because we've lost so much manpower in this war. And the next breath going, well, we've only lost less than 80,000 Ukrainians are being killed in this conflict, when the figure's at least 10 times that, and arguably a million, and maybe even more. Given in Kursk region alone, there's at least 50,000 who've been killed. So, again, Russia just makes its point. This is the goal of the military operation we're conducting. We want neutrality. We want to have total demilitarization. And we want to remove, and I'm going to be very careful how I phrase this because we have to, the extreme elements that exist in Ukraine. I don't think the extreme elements are anywhere near what the problem they were previously, but to some extent they still exist and they still have some degree of influence. So that's what Russia stated. And at the moment, this is going in one ear and out the other. But Zelensky basically just came out and admitted it's over. And I can dress this up with fancy language, but I'm admitting we can't militarily compete with Russia anymore, and it's only going to get worse because it will. So we're going to have to go to diplomacy, and diplomacy doesn't mean that Ukraine has any say. They're going to have to listen to what Russia says and just agree to those terms, and those terms are going to continue to change. As Russia said they were, they had an opportunity to agree to something a few months ago. That is now off the table, and they're just going to make more and more demands the longer this war goes on.
You want an interesting side note? What will remain of Ukraine as Ukrainian sovereign territory reminds me a lot of why the Soviet Union had to go into Afghanistan. There were a few major reasons, but one of the primary reasons was that the West was using Afghanistan, the poppy seeds, to push drugs into Russia and the Soviet Union itself. And so Russia said, enough of that, or the Soviet Union said, enough, we're going to go down and we're going to wipe that out and eliminate that. Of course, it led to a proxy war that, was a big, in a big part, bringing down the Soviet Union in the end. But Ukraine, what remains of Ukraine, the West wants to use for a similar type of thing. I mean, before the SMO, we know that there was a lot of, obviously, the president and his son and a number of other individuals who were in there who were using Ukraine for Western means. And they're, had a number of different biolabs and a number of different things. certain corporations have already come in and bought up land. They want to use it for their thing. The last thing Russia wants is for the West to be on the doorstep, not with military, but with other things that could be used to influence and affect the Russian Federation itself. So it makes me wonder how much of the sovereign territory Russia can afford to allow the West to have access to, because even if you don't have NATO missiles, you still have the power of the corporate industrial complex, as well as the intelligence agencies knocking right on your door.
Well, yeah, but that's well, a whole discussion point in of itself. Because just very briefly, of course, that's unacceptable. But a lot of the assets that the West bought is in now Russian controlled territory, so that's not happening. But yeah, in a broader sense, any agreement means neutrality, and demilitarized means there isn't going to be any NATO forces, any intelligence agencies, any trainers. You're not going to be giving Ukraine weapons. And okay, trying to enforce that is incredibly difficult. No one's disputing that, but that's the basic premise of this. So it can't be, well, okay, say Russia does take, obviously will not take, keeps Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, but then maybe it also wants Kharkov and Sumy, for argument's sake, and maybe Nikolaev and Odessa. But there's that huge slab of Ukraine that continues to exist. And okay, there's Western countries with designs on that, and they'll probably at some point make a play for them, but there's still going to be a rump state somewhere. And that has got to, from the Russian perspective, be on the basis of what Russia has stated is acceptable terms. Otherwise, the war will continue and continue until terms are reached. But the problem is, even if terms are agreed, how do they know they can trust the West to not in 2 or 3 years or 2 or 3 months or whatever it is, suddenly renege on those agreements and backtrack on them? And, then start secretly, covertly trying to rearm Ukraine, and then start to talk about NATO membership again, or, and then the whole conflict will just reignite, and it will start from the newly founded territories, even from a Western perspective. But I think in a future one, we'll go back to talking about plans again, because there's some updates on that, but obviously we've done 20 odd minutes. So I think that's a good point to stop. But this gives a very clear indication of the kind of mindset that's going on in the West, and how utterly flawed it is in terms of what they think their objectives are to end this war, and what they think they can achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think more importantly, just because of what happened with the Minsk agreement, what happened following, the where assurances were made for the Donbass and Donetsk regions that were fallen upon, what we're seeing now in Syria, Russia is going to have to, when all is said and done, have to keep an eye open in Ukraine for the indefinite future, to not allow apathy and latency to bring about, this in another 20 years. Anyway, Paul, I think, as you said, it's a good place to cut off. Want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion and for your insight.
Yeah, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you very much for all your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think would be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.